I can start us off. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. On you, my friends and relatives, my name is Rita Karppinen. I am from the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and I have been employed with MnDOT for almost a year. So we're coming up on that year mark. But Minnesota. For the remaining hour, we're going to dive into a conversation about the story behind the return of lands to tribal nations, or what is known as the land back movement. Whether you're a landowner, local or state government staff member, business owner, tribal member, or descendant, there is so much more that we can learn about our history that will only help create a better understanding about tribal nations. We will hear about the recent state legislative efforts in the return of sacred land to the Upper Sioux community and a small parcel of land back to the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. We will also hear about two other bills that were not passed during the regular session: the return of state land in the White Earth State Forest back to the White Earth Nation, and land in Upper Red Lake back to the Red Lake Nation. Who you'll be primarily hearing from today and who has joined us is MnDOT's Director of Tribal Affairs and Tribal Liaison, Levi Brown. Chimigwich, and thank you to my friend Levi for participating today. He'll share examples of the return of ancestral tribal lands and unceded territories to the various tribes in Minnesota. He'll also take this opportunity to identify and dispel myths and misconceptions surrounding the land back movement, pre-colonial concepts of land, the return of land to descendants of its historical stewards, and modern jurisdictional hurdles. We are hoping for a lot of audience engagement, so feel free to drop the questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And just want to share the purpose of these Lunch and Learns. The intention is to develop a better understanding of these processes and outcomes for all who live, work, and recreate on sacred ancestral tribal lands of the region. And just to share a little information about Levi, he is an Anishinaabe, also a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. Professionally, he spent 16 years working for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in capacities ranging from Leech Lake civics instructor, government to government lead negotiator, environmental land director, where he also represented the 35 tribal nations of EPA Region 5, serving as the National Tribal Operation Committee representative advocating for tribal sovereignty, tribal ecological knowledge, and environmental authority for tribal nations. For the past 6 years, he's been in the role of the MnDOT Director of Tribal Affairs, managing the 11% of state transportation infrastructure that resides within Indian country. He also oversees the highly successful Tribal State Relations training, which is focused on collaboration and understanding. And recently in 2021, he was honored with the National Center of American Indian Enterprise Development 40 Under 40 Award for his work with tribal nations and intergovernmental relations. Now we will hear more from Levi.
Thanks, Rita. I think we should spend about 5 more minutes learning more about Levi, and we can read a little bit more about my bio. That's a little Indian humor. It's kind of painful to listen to all that. But today I wanted folks to understand, where I was coming from, so they understood what information they were getting and the capacity of who that presenter was. Those of you who have attended some of our Lunch and Learns before, I don't think we've ever read off my bio. But today is a kind of an important subject, and it's not something they teach in colleges, universities. To be a land director for a tribal nation in Minnesota, and there's no university for it. There's only lived experiences and the real life experiences. And I felt that it was important for you all to know that, I did that work for 12 years. So with that said, we're going to jump right in. I do want to do one disclaimer that's out there is that, the purpose of our Lunch and Learns that we do within MnDOT, that I do for the staff, and when the IRG asks, one of the main focuses of our Lunch and Learns is to take care of the assumptions, to answer those questions that most times society doesn't take the time to answer. And what I mean by that is not individuals, but just in general, where we kind of, the history is off, but we're still living with those echoes from history. And being the Tribal Affairs Director for MnDOT, I live in a lot of those spaces, right? I have to undo the assumptions or the unknowns, take care of those fears, and help people kind of get to a space where they're comfortable. And that comfort doesn't mean, you're 100% there. What it means is that you feel and you understand a little bit of our history and our shared history, and where that overlap is, and where we end up in a contemporary space. And I think that's always been a driving factor behind our lunch and learns. And so I hope today is kind of the same experience you get. As usual, those of you who have attended in the past, you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat. Rita will interrupt me to ask that specific question, whatever it might be. But, if we're going to really take care of those assumptions and look at our agency and those guests who are here, I think the only way to really do that is to ask those questions and have that conversation. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump into this journey, and we'll have this conversation. Is the screen sharing, Rita? Can you give me a thumbs up if it is?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're good.
All right. Adrian Bond, right off the bat, OCR, what do you got?
Oh, I was just trying to do my thumbs up, but it was a hand raise.
Oh, okay. Hey, glad you're here, Adrian. So, all right. One of the things that I always try to make sure that I capture when I'm going to talk about a subject or have a discussion about something is giving the context, giving the frame of what we are actually talking about. And so I put glimpse into land back because we're literally going to spend 50 minutes on a subject that's 500 years old, right? And a topic that's there. It's contemporary. We deal with it every day. And so I want to make sure I'm honest with you all about how little we are actually going to cover. I just want to take a little bit of time to give you facts, to give you background. And, the IERG, the Indigenous Employee Resource Group for MnDOT, is actually putting us, this is part of a series, a longer series. And so this is just the lead in to kind of help with, providing facts, the basis for discussions, where land back is, what things are, and show some examples, share them, and just have a discussion. I mean, the whole point is a lunch and learn, is hopefully you're all enjoying some great meal, but at the same time, you leave with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of information. That's the real goal behind it all. So one of the things that I probably spend the most of my time in the work I do is the facts, right? Providing facts, providing some understanding for why things are the way they are, what's going on. And the things I have listed here are real facts, that they are things that are beyond, they're not just Levi Brown's assumption. They're either codified in law or they're the reality of what things are. And so one of the first things I always make sure I mention when we're talking about like tribal land or land back is, this focus on what is land back, right? Like, what are we talking about? And so when you're looking at that discussion, you have to really be honest with where's the land going and who are we talking about? Tribal lands that are held in trust are held by the federal government. They're the owners. The United States of America is the owner of these tribal lands. So when you're saying land back, a lot of times if they're going in a trust, the United States of America is the owner of that. That ownership belongs to them. And they may be held in trust for the tribe, but at the end of the day, on the title, it says United States of America. And that's very crucial when you're talking about, you want to just have a conversation about the history of tribal lands, Indian country, the United States of America, creation treaties, all that still plays out today in the reality of today. And that, tribes don't own their own land. Most times the land's in trust, it's the United States of America is the owner. Each tribe has a separate story behind land back, right? Each story, each path is different. They are not the same. And I think that that's probably one of the the things I watch folks do is, we always try to apply a paintbrush to that conversation. We're always looking towards how do we make it easier? Well, because of, our history is not always easy. Sometimes we have to pause and make room to understand that, each tribal nation, the 11 in Minnesota, all have different and separate stories behind their land, impacts to their land, and their reservations and their territories. Which leads into that tribal nations have a separate relationship with the federal government, but they're all treated as wards. Somebody might ask, well, why are you saying they're wards, Levi? Because it goes back to that top bullet, is that each tribal nation, those lands that are in trust, the owner of those lands, the title is in the name of the United States of America, in trust for that tribe. And that paternal relationship that wards of the U.S. federal government has, has been a reality that Indian people have lived with for the last 200 years. And I think that that's something when you're talking about land back or having this discussion, you have to have that foundational understanding to really get the full picture as we go through this, hundreds of years of discussion and history and to bring us to this point today. And when you look at those federal lands, federal law is the governing law over those lands, but then the final decision-making per federal law is federal decision makers. And I find it really, when I would talk about tribal lands, when we have tribal state relationship training here at MnDOT or statewide enterprise, one of the things I often get is, well, if the tribes don't own the land, how come the federal government doesn't give them the land back? Those are questions that are not to be answered by me or our staff or individuals, but they're a question that our future generations will ask and hopefully answer where those are at, because they're relative logical questions, right? If these lands are there, why are they not returned? And one of the things that I think is unique to our state, and again, I'm most familiar with our state of Minnesota, is that federal trust lands exist all over, not just within reservation boundaries. There are lands down by LaCroix, and there are lands down southeastern Minnesota that are federal trust lands that are in trust for the Ho-Chunk Nation. There are lands up on international border with Canada that are owned by Red Lake that are off of the, where most people would know or consider their reservation. There are trust lands, near Detroit Lakes that are held by the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. There are trust lands by Danbury, Wisconsin, just across the river on Minnesota, that are held in trust by Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. So there are lands spread all over the state of Minnesota that people just, again, this is the part of, we have a long history, but it's here and still alive today. We just don't always see it, touch it, feel it, or wherever. And so I think I tell that and I share that part just strictly because I want folks to really grasp that this isn't a new concept. This isn't something that's new, but it's existed. Go ahead. I think it's Joseph.
Joel. Yeah, Joel.
Yeah,
So maybe you're going to get into a discussion on it. This is all new to me, obviously, but was it all how am I trying to say this? I keep hearing how the tribal nations or different areas are sovereign. So can you explain the different or what that means, that they're a sovereign nation, but yet they don't own their land? That's kind of confusing me.
So
thank you.
Joe, great question. I mean, this is why we do a lunch and learn. I'm a tribal citizen. I'm from Leech Lake. I'm confused by it as well, Joe. But our history and Indian law and the Supreme Court, they are the ones, and we'll have a legal section. I think it's part 3 of this series that we're having through the fall. And they'll go deeper into it. So I hope you attend that, Joe. But I'm going to do my best to kind of set the framework for that. Is when you read the U.S. Constitution, Indians are mentioned in the Constitution as though they are sovereign nations. Treaties may be made with Indians, sovereign nations. So the treaties to establish states, statehood, to acquire tribal land, those treaties were land cession treaties. And so to acquire something legally, right, we're a country of laws, you had to have got it from those who had the title to give it to you. Well, as time went on, Indian people still existed, but the federal government, had several court decisions there, the Marshall Trilogy, followed by several others, but the Marshall Trilogy really kicked it off where the federal government assumed this role as a trustee, this role that we must protect Indian interests. We have a trust responsibility that exists there. And so over time, Joe, that ideology that has kind of morphed into where we're at today, where you just did ask a question of like, why do they hold the lands, but they're established? Because our root law, the U.S. Constitution, mentions tribal nations, treats us as sovereign nations, but over time, the federal government has interpreted us as they needed to take care of our lands. They needed to take care of us as trustees, as wards of the federal government. So I hope that kind of answers that question, Joe. At least that's the foundation for that broader discussion that'll come forward.
Yeah, no, that helps. Yeah, I grew up north, and I'll be totally transparent. Most of my relatives were bigots when it came to Indians. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the perspective from you folks, versus the perspective that I was raised with.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Joe. I mean, that's why I let off this conversation is that, we try to fill these spaces with the facts and the knowledge that we have, and we share each other's histories and past, and I think that's the beautiful thing about the agency we work in, but the state we live in, and the people, how we share it and what we look at. So thanks, Joe. Final kind of thought on this, and it's something I just wanted to mention because I think it really matters when we're talking about land back. Working as the environmental land director for Leech Lake for as many years as I did, there was this movement around land acknowledgements. And so when I started at MnDOT, we didn't do one right away. One reason being is that, land back is, especially when it comes to land acknowledgements, a lot of focus is on action. We need, there should be some action to follow. And so we didn't do our first land acknowledgement, and we didn't do it until 2021. And most folks might, wonder why or what it was. And I just kind of gave you the reason why, is that there needed to be action, need to be understanding behind it. And I'll share in a couple slides, I'll share a little bit of things where we did the action we took hold and why we took them and what was behind the motive behind what we were doing. And so I just wanted to share that fact. Some more facts?
Levi?
Yes. Yeah.
We have a question in the chat. So the question comes from Nina. I live close to Shakopee, Metawakan Sioux community. I remember a while back reading that the community purchased additional land. How does that land work? Do they own it? If they don't, how is that fair?
So Nina, if you go on to, I would assume it's Scott County or Dakota County. I assume it's Scott County where they bought it. If you go on that county website, the GIS website, and you click on that parcel, it's going to tell you who owns it. And if the land is in trust, which means the federal government is the owner, it will say that. It'll say United States government, blah, 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 in trust for Shakopee, Metawakan Sioux community. If it is in fee, meaning that Shakopee is still paying taxes, it will say owner, which is just Shakopee. I hope that answered your question, Nina. Was there more to that question, Rita?
No.
Okay. And I think, that's Nina's bringing up a great point that sometimes, people think that once a tribe buys land, it's automatically in trust. It's not. The trust process can take sometime 20 years. It's the fastest I've ever seen land go into trust is, through the normal fee to trust process is about 10 months. That was one time in a generation that I've seen that happen. So just want to make sure I frame that up. But again, if you ever have more questions about general land or trust land or fee land, there is on our website, Tribes and Transportation, we have a kind of a recorded video talking about tribal lands. We can go more in depth on. One of the facts that I think when people look at that relationship is because the federal government is the landowner, they're the title holder to those lands, that the state of Minnesota or any state in the union cannot condemn those federal tribal trust lands. And it's not because of the tribe. Like, I think that that's really one of those things where people often they rush to blame the tribes for, not doing certain things or not doing whatever. But because the decision maker when it comes to tribal trust land is the federal government, the tribes have obviously influence on that. But a lot of times the tribes are subject to federal law. And so that kind of goes to the second bullet, where federal law requires a maximum grant of easement to be limited to 50 years. So when MnDOT goes and wants to build a road or reallocate our grant of easement, it's not the tribe who says 50 years, it's the federal government. And I think that's, again, probably something most folks don't understand about Indian country or tribal nations, tribal lands, is that, they're part of an awkward love triangle between the state of Minnesota, the federal government, and themselves. And I don't know, we as the state employees in Minnesota, when we're looking at, like state right away for MnDOT, I think it would be very problematic and difficult for us to do roads and projects if we constantly had to wait for, counterparts from another government to give us the okay. I think that would make things in economic development very difficult. Another fact is when land goes into trust, it becomes Indian country. It becomes part of that jurisdictional. Go ahead, Rita.
We have another question in the chat from Todd. Could you address property tax on tribal fee and tribal trust? Kind of ties into the conversation I think you're having right now. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Thanks. So Todd, just to kind of your question of taxes. So fee is the land is held in fee status just as though a private landowner owns it, right? The land is assessed. It is, there's taxes put onto that land, and then the tribe must pay those taxes. When the land goes into trust, that land the landowner becomes the United States federal government, which is, again, and no state and union can tax the federal government. It doesn't work that way. So that is why there's no taxes that go that way. Good question, Doug. One of the other, like, kind of getting into that part of regardless of location is I led that, other fact that there are trust lands all over the state, because there truly are. And I think that that's the part where people, if there's ever a conversation about a tribe and land or this and that, or a tribe buys a land here, we already live amongst it. We just don't know it. We don't feel it, touch it. We don't really see it. And I think that should give you some idea about how tribes manage their land, what they do with it, what they don't do. I think that that's probably a telltale sign, again, that people, maybe a lot of times when we look at tribal land, that's another assumption, right? That the moment tribe owns land, things will change. That's not always the case. Most often it's not the case. And one thing when you look at tribes owning land is tribes only have jurisdiction over only have jurisdiction over tribal members, and they only have jurisdiction over non-tribal members when Congress specifically grants it. And again, we'll have a whole legal section on this, but I think that's important because a lot of times what I've seen over my time working in Indian country or working for state government or in my role is that when tribes buy land or things, there's a question about reservation boundaries, that somehow, non-tribal members are thrust into the middle of that, to choose a side. You want the Indians to do this, or do you want the state to? It doesn't matter, because the federal government is the only ones that can tell when tribes have jurisdiction over non-tribal members. And, so when land goes into trust, or that term of Indian country is moved, or the dimensions of Indian country is moved, it doesn't change who has jurisdiction over non-tribal members. And I think I just wanted to make sure I'm clear on that, because that's one thing I've heard so often is, oh, now this is part of the reservation, or this tribal land. I'm no longer I'm going to be subject to tribal laws. It does not work that way. And another thing too is tribal boundaries. So like reservations, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is responsible for that. per US federal code. So, but that doesn't mean a sovereign like the state of Minnesota, has to agree or disagree or whatever that might be with those boundaries. There is that relationship that exists. And now, does it put stress on a relationship if the BIA or the tribe or the state don't see eye to eye on that? Oh yeah. I mean, we have that a lot of areas in the state. And I think that that's part of this unknown or assumptions that these issues, these problems exist daily. They're there. They're not historic in any form or fashion. They're very contemporary. And I really want to make sure that people kind of have this, these facts about Indian countries. It's not always just historical. It is playing out today. And it plays out every day. So I'm going to pause. Are there any other questions before I kind of keep going? Any thoughts on these facts or things kind of laying this baseline for a broader discussion?
I have a quick question. So I don't anymore past that age group, but so there's some areas where we could hunt, grouse, birds on tribal lands, and then other areas where it says you can't. So that's always been kind of confusing to me. Is that the Congress gave one tribe the right to designate who can be on their lands and doing what, but another tribe didn't get that right? That's kind of always been really confusing when we've been trying to figure out where we could hunt and where we couldn't, or fish is another one. Can you kind of explain that a little bit, please?
Great question, Joe. I mean, Joe's getting right at the heart of this conversation, right? The unknown. So the whys, or why is it that way? Well, I'm pretty sure that if you went down to, Oklahoma, you could, do different things that you wanted to do down there that you couldn't do in Vermont, right? Or vice versa. You could go to California and do certain things that you cannot do in Minnesota, or vice versa. And so it's really important. That's why I switched slides here, is that each tribe has they have the same relationship at the base with the federal government, but how they choose to use their own individual sovereignty in its tribal nations around land management, land governance, wherever it might be, that is their choice. But that's the sovereignty part. That's the inherent sovereignty of their choice to what they choose to do or not do. And so that's directly tied to that separate history as well, right? Like how their histories come out. So it's one of those things where it's okay to not know every reservation, everything. I mean, I've been doing the work for 20 plus years, and it moves, it shifts, right? Elections, different things. I mean, even if you go even further and you look at land use as a more general conversation with like the U.S. government or state government or whatever it might be, but think about this: you hear people run campaigns on like mining or fracking or mineral extraction or whatever that topic might be. That government, the people are choosing what they'd like to do, how they'd like to be governed, and how they'd like to do it. It's no different than a tribe. Same thing. Tribes have elected officials who, they govern and they make laws and they choose them. So I think that's the sovereignty part that, I'm trying to hopefully peel back the layer that you get to see a little bit, Joe, is that tribes, when they execute and do those, or the rules change, or however they do it, that's just them exercising their sovereignty. So I hope that kind of answered the question, Joe. Great question. Appreciate you engaging. Any other questions?
Yes, that does. Thank you very much.
No problem. All right. Well,
sorry, Levi.
I'm
gonna interject quick. Chris put a question in the chat. Does the federal government make payments in lieu of taxes for trust lands to locals, in parentheses?
Hell, yes. Payment in lieu, yes. And those are, they're not as stable as one might think, right? They move up and down. A lot of federal lands within their boundaries, like counties, they've had that payment in lieu of taxes. No, those exist. And I really think too is like Leech Lake, where I'm from, the national forest that has all these federal lands within the national forest. The revenues that come off the wood that leaves, those federal lands, there is a 25% share with each of the school districts, and some of the those school districts are located primarily off the reservation, but they have chunks within the reservation. And so there's a lot of split there. The only partner that doesn't get any of that money is Leech Lake, Band of Ojibwe, that tribe. They don't get any benefit from the logging. So I think it's, again, history impacts contemporary times. Each has its own story, its own history. And I think that's where, when I made that example right away about how much we're going to talk about today and how much is still left to be talked about. And even in my time, I will never know everything. I won't know every history of each of the tribes in Minnesota. And I think one of the assumptions we make is we try to use that paintbrush over that overall assumption or relationships that exist there. Or even, I think Joe was pretty direct about the part of what he didn't know versus what he knew or was going to learn. And I think that's, when we do lunch and learns, that's the hope, is that what we don't know, we're going to try to learn about. And if we still don't know more, we'll read more about it. We'll learn about it. So appreciate that. Any other questions, Rita?
Not at this time.
So we as in MnDOT, we have done several, and here are some examples of projects. Up in District 1, there's a place, and it's the name of what it's called. It was called Passion Pit. It's up off of Highway 61 on the North Shore, but it also was land that was known as Chippewa City. And it was right in Grand Marais, right outside the north side of Grand Marais. And it was known as Chippewa City because Highway 61, for those who are, would like to understand this history, is most of our highways were at some point away were, Indian trails or roadways, pathways that indigenous people took around the state of Minnesota. And so 61 was one of those specifically, right? Goes, if you've ever driven 61, it's like right along the shore. And it's a beautiful drive, but if you think back a couple hundred years ago, what it might have been like, what it turned into is, eventually a highway, but then it was, just an Indian trail. And so why I'm mentioning Chippewa City is because Grand Portage, who most of their ancestors went back and forth between Chippewa City, which is again north of Grand Marais, and then Grand Portage Reservation, that was where they stayed. And they stayed there because it was, Indians weren't really allowed to stay in town in some of the, in the actual where the town was. They stayed on the fringes of it. And that's common all over Indian country. A lot of towns who had interactions with reservations, they have areas where tribal members kind of stayed on the fringe of town. And this happened to be a historical site. There's still some signage up there. There's an old church that's kind of in that same area. And so there's a lot of historical significance, especially to some of the tribal leaderships whose family were born on that land. And they, that was a place that gathered. And so that was a land back project that we had done up in District 1. And it was, again, we weren't using it. The county had supported the tribe receiving it. It was something that we had felt should be returned that way. Shingabee in District 2, same thing. This one is a pit I'm very familiar with in Shingabee. It's an old tribal allotment. If you look underneath it, it's part of a tribal allotment that existed there. And so that's a project that's working to work with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe on a land return there as well. And then the Trunk Highway 316 alignment in District 8, that's already happened. That's a more historic one. But again, when you look at land back, sometimes we've already done things, but we don't talk about them, right? The importance of institutional knowledge, of institutional history, that knowing these things that we've already done. And so when we go and do something, we think we're the first time we've ever done it, when we probably have already done it. And that one was at the Upper Sioux Indian community. It was, some of these are smaller in acreage. They're not, thousands of acres, but they're lands that we have returned and in the land back. And then Grand Portage right away. This one I think is very familiar because historically we have done it, but we're continuing to do it now as well. And what what I mean by that is that there are lands up in Grand Portage where we've have 500 feet of right of way, 800 feet of right of way, these huge swaths of right of way that we we're working with Grand Portage to return. And I think it's ironic that, you know, it's taken so long to get there. But again, you know, the state of Minnesota and tribal nations went through a period where we didn't necessarily have the most diplomatic relationship. And that's okay. I mean, it's not like we had to, but at the same time, I think you have to have a really bad relationship before you realize how nice it is to have a nice relationship, right? Where you're working together to solve problems. And so I look at the past as not something we have to dwell on and make sure that we just don't repeat that past, because we can do it better. Obviously, it wasn't the best way to do things. So I hope when you think about land back projects, you're keeping that in mind, is that there are, as I think Chairman Jensfeld from Upper Sioux talked about, is that there's the wrongs of the past, but today we're here making the rights, you know, making the right decision go forward. So I think that's something that when you think about land back, or you think about these conversations, I mean, it's all about that mindset and really truly understanding what and how we're talking about it. So with that foundation kind of built in, I'm trying to, again, it's half unbuilt foundation. It's probably the bottom layer because there's still so much to talk about. I want to talk about examples, real life examples that have happened, and that, you know, the sun still rose the next day. Nothing, you know, there was no major shift. There was no changes, and that, you know, these projects have gone on. They have been executed. They've, you know, been fulfilled. And I think that, you know, a lot of times it's the fear or the unknown of something happening that really gets people in a bad place. And so these three examples I've shared are all different, and there's more than just what I'm sharing here, but I wanted to pick examples that were all different. So there's private transactions that are land back. In Boys Fort in 2022, there was a 28,000 acre land back done by the Potlatch Delic LLC. That corporation, you know, worked with Boys Fort and other nonprofits to do a land back at that point. And I think when you look at that one, I mean, it's private. It's a private industry doing that. You know, taking the wrong of the past and making a right today. Is it, you know, again, the perfect situation? I'm sure Boys Fort or Potlatch wouldn't say either one was, but again, being here in this time in this space, they had that conversation. They worked through it, and that's where they ended up. Another example now, which is completely different, not a private entity, not a private landholder, but the United States federal government. The Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe just this summer finalized and signed off, and the deeds have been now transferred with the U.S. Forest Service, which would be the Department of Agriculture. And so 11,778 acres up in on the Leech Lake Reservation were transferred from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Interior. You know, that's a federal to federal transfer. And what's very unique about this one, and where I think it's, again, a story. Every transaction has a story, right? In this one, you know, there was transactions done in the 1940s to the 1950s between the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture, where the Secretary of Interior had, you know, tribal individually held trust lands called allotments, and basically was selling them for pennies, you know, the acre to the Department of Agriculture, which was the U.S. Forest Service. And within, you know, 10 years, they'd sold roughly 28,000 acres. But what made them stop was it was deemed that was illegal, that transaction should not be happening, and that the Secretary of Interior did not have that authority and should not have been doing that. And so this first round of transactions is, again, there was a wrong, something that was illegal, and making it right today. One thing I'll say, and I think it's because I managed, the lands of Leech Lake and governed within the boundaries for 12 years, is, the only folks like on Leech Lake, the Leech Lake lands that are there, when you look at no trespassing signs or even marking those lines, the only folks that really post their lands is the U.S. Forest Service. The state, county, federal lands are the state, county, and tribal lands. No, but we don't post those lands. And so I think that's really important when you look at that specific interaction there. And then again, last year or this spring, a state transaction, a transaction between state-held lands to the Upper Sioux Indian community, and that was 1,200 acres, 1,200 acres, and that was a transaction between state government and a tribal government, which again is the federal government. Those lands will be in trust. And I think when you look at that transaction there, and you look at, the Leech Lake transaction was between Ojibwe and the federal government. The Upper Sioux transaction was between the state government and the tribe. You notice a common thing, and Joe asked about sovereignty. You notice the sovereignty part of this, right? Boys Fort is an Ojibwe tribe interacting with a private corporation. Leech Lake interacting with a federal trustee, the U.S. Forest Service. Upper Sioux can be interacting with a sovereign government like the state of Minnesota. That sovereignty is used in many different levels. And I think that that's one of the parts where the tribal governments aren't just limited to this small space. They work in spaces that are really complex and very difficult a lot of times. And I think that, I wanted to share this landscape of different land back projects that have already been executed and fulfilled before we talk about the couple of bills that were existing there, White Earth and Red Lake. One thing about when you look at the numbers that are presented here, I roughly gave you almost 40,000 acres of land that had returned land back. One of the things I think is unique, and I don't mean unique in the sense that it's positive, good or bad. Don't mean it like that, but I meant in the sense of there's 40,000 acres of land back, but the state of Minnesota has 51 million acres. That's what makes up the whole state. And so when you look at that percentage, we are like 0.000. It's a very small percentage of these lands that really, like I said, is make up Indian country, but it's still kind of a unique perspective when you stop and look at the volume that makes up the state and what the volume of land back, how small that actually is, that amount is. So before I go any further, any questions and thoughts about this slide, questions about it?
Bettina put in the chat, the Upper Sioux have not started the land to federal trust process yet. So not a question, but.
Yep. Thanks, Bettina. So Bettina pointed out that it hasn't started that process, which again, each tribe gets to decide how they want to go about that, do land and fee, trust, whatever that might be. So thanks, Bettina. Okay, Adrian?
Yep, so I did it. So do all federally recognized tribes have trust lands or no?
I don't know an example of a federally recognized tribe that does not have trust lands. I do know that there are some Pueblo in the Southwest that have what they would call restricted fee lands that they don't pay taxes on.
And then if there is a tribe that's not federally recognized, then I guess, is there a process that a tribe that has not been recognized could become recognized and then get land and put it into trust, or not really?
Yeah, no, there are individuals who are petitioning the federal government, to be recognized. That happens all over the country. There are 30-something tribes in southeastern United States who are state recognized tribes, but are not federally recognized. So there it is. Again, it's our history is alive with today. they're still interacting consistently and constantly today. So good question, Adrian. Rita?
We have another question in the chat from James. What are the competing perspectives you encounter internally at MnDOT when it comes to deciding whether or not MnDOT land is transferred to tribes for no charge? Is everybody on board with not charging from the start? Does MnDOT have to overcome an administrative desire to charge tribes for market value for land acquired for market value through highway user funds?
So again, we are not exempt from state law or the rules we have. So we have to follow all of those rules. And I think that's what you're getting at the end is, I mean, if we use certain funds to buy certain parcel of land, we can't, by law, we can't just give those lands away. We have to justify every action we do. So it's one of those things where I think our internal disputes or internal conversations, we don't really have any of those because we are an agency that's governed by laws, but at the same time, we also are an agency governed by what we use, right? What we utilize and what we don't. And so we have a lot of, past historic gravel pits and different things around the area that we obviously don't use. And they become, in like the Grand Portage instance, they became more of an issue for the city of Grand Marais, the county, versus what our use was for it, which, was primarily we didn't have a use for it. So good question. Rita?
So James responds back saying Passion Pit was no charge. I was surprised that was possible. And then we have another comment in the chat from Adrian. The MnDOT are not a federally recognized tribe in Minnesota that is currently actively fighting for federal designation and land. And she provided a link. Just doing a time check. We got about 10 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Yep, James. I'll just kind of go to that comment first of the surprise. I think at the end of the day, that's the hope is that we move beyond that it's a surprise, right? Like if that was there and that whole highway, that whole corridor was Indian use and that has historical significance to individuals and we have the ability to do something, we should, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we were trying to do there because not only was it just MnDOT, but the city and the county had supported it. And so, hopefully it's not always a surprise. Let's put it that way. So, and so kind of the final part, and I don't have, necessarily a way to wrap this up because we have multiple segments coming forward. But I do want to end with this is that there were two bills looking at the return of the White Earth State Forest and then lands up, state forest lands up near Red Lake. Again, neither of those bills were passed. But I want to make sure that people, when they're having this discussion or they hear that discussion going out there, that's why I talked about the facts, the foundations from the Indian country exist all over the state of Minnesota. You drive through it. You're probably constantly driving through it. Or, if you have family up in the north or you have cabins or wherever it might be, you're constantly interacting with it. And it's not something that's, again, it's not something that people have to fear or that somehow there's some trickery going on. It's one of those things where every story, every tribe's land story, wherever that is tied to actual actions that have happened. And so their contemporary asks are just that. They're tied to those, to what that future is. Or what that future could be and what their asks are. And I think that that's kind of my whole point of this conversation and going through this is that, keep an open mind. Don't, read about it. See what the history is and make sure that, if there's questions you have or different points of views that might exist there, keep that open mind and be willing to learn because it's a shared past and a shared history we all have and we're living it today. The reality is we're living it today. So any other questions? You got me for 6 more minutes and there should be, tons of questions, I would think. I mean, I'm here completely, I wouldn't say naked. I'm wearing clothes, obviously, but I don't have, I'm here to help you all kind of, you know, addressing those unknowns or assumptions you might have, or just general questions.
Yeah, so we have a few things in the chat. Kristen shared a couple links about White Earth and Red Lake, and James mentioned, thank you, no charge was the right call. But another question is, are you aware of any movements for private citizens to participate in land back like lakefront property? This comes from Lisa.
So I'm not, sorry, Lisa, I'm just, what I'm thinking about is like, if you Google and you look at like each one of, the reservations and read about their histories and read about their past, they're so all distinct, right? They're just different. And so depending on where private citizens live or what they might be thinking or what part of their experiences in life, I think that's where you see there's tons of opportunity. And I share that experience in life or where they're at because one of the presidents was the most who really started the self-governance, to make that framework possible for Indian tribes was Richard Nixon. President Nixon of all people, right? You might think, where did that come from? Well, his roommate or his football coach in college was a tribal member, a tribal citizen. And just by that experience of understanding what his people went through or what it might went through, helped him have a better understanding of where tribes were at and their historical significance. And so I think somebody's sharing something in the chat there, but there's tons of areas to do that. And it just is all about, your experiences where you're at and where you're located, I think, because we are such a diverse state and we, from the Southwest to the Southeast to the Northeast to the Northwest, tribes in each of those areas are just their history's a little bit different, and there's a lot there. So there was another question I thought in there, Rita. Sorry.
Yeah, yep. And there's a lot of great resources being shared in the chat, but the next question, maybe the last one is MnDOT encouraging employees to attend the Intertribal Council trainings being conducted around the state? I know at MDE they have encouraged employees there to attend this training within their first 2 years.
The Intertribal Council.
Tribal-
I'm not.
Tribal state relations, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the statute 1065 requires those state employees who are interacting with tribes or, to take the training. And I, lost at MnDOT, I mean, we're the same way. I mean, one of the things that how our model works at MnDOT is, we have an Office of Tribal Affairs, which I obviously lead, but all 5,800 employees roughly have some stake in the relationship, right? There's some responsibility within there. Some is very high responsibility, some is lower. But at the end of the day, me as the Tribal Affairs Director, I'm the capacity for our team, our staff at MnDOT to be successful working with tribal nations and to make sure our projects, throughout Indian country are successful, which means that, we're able to deliver them, but yet still have input from communities that we historically haven't had a whole lot of relationship with. So yes, Ted, we definitely encourage that. And I hope that other, offices and other agencies outside of MnDOT are doing the same. With the attendance I see, I definitely think that a lot of other agencies are doing that.
Absolutely. And there was a comment in the chat saying, thanks, Levi. Always interesting to listen to you and learn more about the tribal nations. Are in Canada, First Nations referring to they were the first real civilized nations regarding of who may have been where first. It is only when we open our minds to things we don't know instead of living in our own bubbles do we learn and better understand all of our fellow citizens, no matter their background. And with that really impactful comment, I'm going to ask Levi if you have any closing remarks.
I do. Maybe I don't want to end it, close it right there on that because I see Joe's got his hand up, but I just want to say this to that comment. Those of you who are still on here listening, and I know we're ending here, Google Benjamin Franklin and the Great Law of Peace. because one thing I think is very unique is how indigenous people in this continent practiced democracy and executed separation of powers, and they had a complicated scheme of governance. And if you look at the ideas that were eventually put into our Constitution, our separation of powers that Benjamin Franklin, he kind of fathered, I think in a lot of ways you might want to really look at where he got those ideas from. It's pretty ironic. I read a book about that. It's pretty ironic when you think about things. So good point there. And I'll end with one question. Go ahead, Joe.
Kind of more of a comment. I'm not the best typist, so I'd rather talk. But I'm 64, grew up north, and we are very fortunate to live in a state that has a lot of interest in diversity and inclusion and understanding different people, whether that be their sexual orientation, their gender identity. No, this with the Indians, I mean, this gives me such a huge different perspective from what was pounded into my head as a kid. I'll share, my grandparents, we were scared to death to go in the basement of the farmhouse because we were told the Indians would get us. And it's just, I think it's exciting that we're finally maturing, at least in this state, as a society that is understanding other people, not just saying if it's not my way or you don't feel like I do, there's something wrong with you. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate this.
Thanks, Joe, for sharing and the interaction. I'll leave this one final thought for those 100 or so people are still out here. Remember that tribal nations are a political class and have a unique political history and tie to the United States of America and the state of Minnesota, and and then not a racial class. And that's not Levi Brown. That's a United States Supreme Court. So with that, Miigwech, Rita, you want to take us home? Thank you.
So as we close out today, I think I saw about 245 people join us for our lunch and learn, which is impressive and speaks to the importance of this topic. I would like to mention that Levi stated earlier that this was a glimpse into land back, and this is a starting point, a launching pad for everyone on this call to take it one step further and do their own research on credible resource pages. And there's a lot of great resources in the chat right now, and including the Tribal State Relations Training Resource tab. But I want to thank you, Levi, for guiding us through that topic. I want to thank the Indigenous Employee Resource Group and to all of you attending today's Lunch and Learn. Take care. Be good.